Is God calling you to a religious vocation? Find answers at the 2024 Vocational Awareness Program, A Weekend of Discernment, on Friday, June 14th through Sunday, June 16th at the University of Dallas in Irving. Discernment is not a journey you need to make alone. The 34th Annual Discernment Weekend is an opportunity to join others in seeking answers about a religious vocation. There are no fees to attend. Private rooms and all meals are provided. For more information and to complete the discernment application, visit vapinfo.org.
The Guadalupe Radio Network thanks Little Elm Eye Care for their support of local Catholic radio. Little Elm Eye Care is owned by Drs. Bert and Leslie Bubella, parishioners of St. Francis of Assisi Parish in Frisco. They specialize in family vision care, comprehensive eye exams, contact lenses, and the treatment of eye diseases and injuries. Little Elm Eye Care is located at 1200 East El Dorado Parkway, Suite 100, across from the Little Elm Athletic Complex. They can be reached by calling 972-292-0900 or on the web at littleelmeyecare.com.
Thanks for listening to KATH 910 AM Frisco, Dallas, Fort Worth. Catholic radio for your soul in North Texas on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Heard also at grnonline.com and on your smartphone. Welcome to A Life Lived Joyfully, brought to you by the Guadalupe Radio Network. Join us as we explore the call to holiness and the life of virtue. Here's your host, Msgr Charles Pope.
And it is I, and I speak to you from Washington, D.C., to wherever you are in the United States of America or anywhere in the world with this worldwide internet we have. You know, I want to talk to you today about the interview of 60 Minutes, make some comments of my own about some of the Pope's answers. I think overall it was a good interview, and I think he was... I think right on target with some of his answers in terms of being clear and concise and so on. So I would say that I want to take a look at some of them. I want to maybe look at four of the I think most crucial ones first. I won't necessarily take them in order, but I think that there's a vision here of, maybe the first one we want to look at is to women deacons, the Pope just says no. Now, again, there's a slight elaboration on that, but I think that's got to be the proper answer. This isn't something that we can do. She starts out by saying that there's the idea of this, women deacons and so on. She says, a young lady who's growing up and maybe has dreams about being in leadership in the church, and what do you have to say to her? And is it possible for her to imagine she could be a deacon or maybe a member of the clergy? And the Pope just says no. And you can see she's visibly struck by just the kind of the abruptness. It wouldn't be appropriate for her to dream about that. It's just not going to happen. Anyway, it was a very curt reply, shall we say, when but he did spell it out. He says, the deacons receive holy orders, and holy orders is reserved to men alone. At the end of the day, he's often been very clear about this in terms, especially about priests. The idea that, not just the idea, but the teaching is very definitive on this, and he often cites Pope John Paul. Some theologians at the time when John Paul issued the teaching said, oh, well, he didn't use the exact right language, you got to use exactly this word or that. But John Paul was very clear. He said that he wanted to speak about this matter, and he wanted it to be held definitively by all the faithful that the church has no power whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women. So again, in a matter, he invoked the Petrine office, to strengthen the brethren, in a matter of grave, importance, and that he expected the matter to be definitively held. That the answer had to be no. This ongoing argument that we just go over and over and over again has to stop. It's just the answer is no. Now, but there have been those who have tried to argue, but isn't the question of deacons a little different? Now, the answer to that is no. If by deacon you mean a deacon who shares in what we call holy orders. You remember that holy orders comes in three different levels. There's bishop, priest, and deacon. Now, we don't call it the sacrament of priesthood or the sacrament of diaconate or the sacrament of bishop. We call it the sacrament of holy orders. There are these three distinct levels or orders within the sacrament. Therefore, again, if by deacon we mean someone having holy orders, the answer is no. The Pope is very, very clear to say and to teach that. Now, then, though, he does say, well, in a way, if we think of just the word deacon meaning of servant or some sort of service in the church, well, of course, women have done that from the beginning, and men too, of course, who aren't ordained. And so again, but he's saying that's in effect he's implying that's a different meaning of the word. It's not the sacrament. And here's where I think we have to be careful. You know, and I know what's going to start to happen is that people get lazy about using words. They tend to become, shall we say, who's to say what the word really means and this kind of stuff. And they'll just start calling women the deacon or the deaconess, and then next thing you know, they say, well, she's a deacon. Let her wear the robes, and And so, again, there's going to be increasing demand. I think that what we should do is to reserve the use of the word deacon for those who are ordained deacons. There does seem to be, the problem is that the word deacon just simply means servant. And it could be used, and I think was on 2 occasions by St. Paul, to just simply refer to those who are engaged in any or some service. But there's also in the Acts of the Apostles a group of men who have hands laid on them, who are called deacons, servants, but they have hands laid on them. Can we just use these words vaguely, interchangeably? And I would argue no. Of course, I often find I lose arguments when it comes to words. For example, I've always thought, because I know Latin and Greek, and so I'm always a little annoyed at how a lot of the words we use today are no longer what they originally meant. Like, for example, everyone says, oh, it was decimated. They just decimated them, as between totally wiped out. But that's not what the word decimate means. It means to reduce something by a tenth. I hope you hear that word, the word decim, like 10, is but it doesn't mean to totally wipe it out. But, of course, I've lost that argument decades ago, when even reporters and journalists and others who kind of run the language, started using it to mean totally wiped out. Or why do we drive in parkways and park on driveways? Or the word manufacture, literally in Latin roots, means to be handmade, whereas we often mean the opposite of handmade. So I know words morph and change, and so I would say we ought to be very careful not to just pitch a word around like deacon to mean just service or servant, while we also have a proper noun, a deacon, who's an ordained man. We should, I think, be careful. But you know what's going to happen. A lot of people aren't going to be careful. However, the Pope did give a definitive no. If by deacon we mean holy orders, the answer is no. Now, this surprised even some people in the leadership of the last synod, who had said, hey, he's remanded this question for further study, and and so now it would seem that Francis has kind of gone around all that and said, well, look, you can have all the meanings you want, but if it comes down to ordaining women to the order we call deacons, that's just not going to happen. They say, well, what happened to the synodal process? And I think that's a valid question. I don't agree, obviously, with the question of there being deacons or deaconesses in the church, but I can say that they feel a little betrayed, so to speak, by the movement. A lot of people also felt quite betrayed when the question of same-sex blessings and things was tabled at the synod for possible further discussion. It, too, just got railroaded through in that Fiducia Supplicans, the ill-fated document. So again, look, I think that at some level, people then start to raise questions. Well, what do we mean by synodality when, you can talk it, and then all of a sudden the Pope, just in some interview with a woman on 60 Minutes, just says, here's the teaching, and this is where it's going to stay. I think there are legitimate concerns about that. I don't think that's just true of Francis. I think probably John Paul and Benedict gave too many interviews, too, and I think that we give too much weight to the interviews. However, I do think in this matter the Pope has answered correctly and definitively. It's just odd that it would take place in a interview with a woman named Nora O'Donnell on some show called 60 Minutes in the United States, rather than in a more formal setting where the Pope could say, "Look, I've been pondering this, and in terms of the synodal process, I don't think we can go forward with this discussion. I can't be honest with you if I didn't say to you that I just don't see a way forward for women to receive the office of deacon, which is part of holy orders. But it's sort of unofficially on the table, and now it's sort of been taken off, or has it? It's an interview in 60 Minutes, and so on. So probably more to be discussed. But the answer is good and it's clear. Now, again, let's review for a moment while we're at this then. Why does the church teach that women can't be ordained priests? Let's start with priests just first of all. And the answer is, of course, that Jesus is the high priest. But remember, Jesus isn't male just because he happens to be male. He's male because he's the groom of the church, and the church is the bride. And so Christ is both the priest, the great high priest of the church, but also he is also the great bridegroom of the church, and the church is his bride. This idea of male clergy and, the whole idea that at a holy mass, Christ is with his church, the bride. The mass isn't just some ordinary sort of celebration. It's a wedding feast. It's styled that way. It's rooted, of course, in the great passionate sacrifice of Christ on the cross, as St. Paul says, the great mystery that a man should lay down his life, for his wife, love his wife like Christ loves the church. It's caught up in the mystery of how Christ treats his church, the bride, and all of this is tied up in the liturgy. And so again, we have here an image of the priesthood that isn't just it's male just because Christ happened to be male, but Christ is male because he's the groom, and the church is the bride. And this also extends then to the whole understanding of the holy orders. Granted, it is a little odd that there's a branch of the priesthood that is not priestly, but refers to the deacons. However, this was true in Judaism as well. You sort of had a distinction. You'd have the high priest, who was taken from among the priests, and then you had priests, but you also had Levites, and there were different rankings in the Jewish priesthood, and this was taken over into the church. And we've always, though, considered holy orders to be of these 3 degrees. And to simply say, well, now we're going to separate out the diaconate and make it no longer part of a holy order so that we can put women into the role. Well, I want to ask you to consider that, first of all, that is unfortunately what we often do in the modern age. We just shred stuff from the antiquity without really thinking through all the implications. Don't do that. The church can't do that. Part of it, too, is also, I want to say, it would be complete radical rethinking of the entire sacrament of holy orders in its essence. And we have to not go and play around like that with it, just because we have our own little agenda. But I would also add, I want you to think of the ecumenical complications that would be created if we were to start toying with the diaconate like that. Remember, the church has 2 lungs. We've got the Eastern Church and the Western Church, and sadly among some of the Eastern churches, they departed to become the so-called Orthodox churches. We seek reunion with them, and we ought not toy with things that we have in common with them, the sacraments and so on. And we need to be very careful before we start to reconfigure these things, which would make reunion almost impossible. You may remember that many of the Orthodox churches reacted that way when fiducia supplicans came. So, again, the answer is the Pope is sympathetic that women want to be so-called ordained, but he did set up 2 commissions to study the matter, and it's still part of the synodal discussions. This is probably that he's trying to be sympathetic, maybe even indulgent. But at the end of the day, I think he was pretty clear the answer is going to have to be no. All right. So, Again, we'll go on now. A second important topic that came up, and I mentioned to you on Tuesday, this topic, is surrogacy, surrogate motherhood, so to speak, which is part of the IVF kind of approach. It's not. There are forms of IVF that don't involve surrogate motherhood. But on the other hand, this idea of IVF, in vitro fertilization, along with things like surrogate motherhood and so on, Pope Francis said, again, it is not authorized. It cannot be done. He says, isn't it interesting? He says that it's, sadly, he thinks that surrogacy has largely become a business. And this is very bad. He said, very bad. Earlier this year, he called surrogacy despicable. Those are strong words, you see, coming from the Pope. It's funny, he always has this reputation of sort of being kind of this nice guy who says, soft things that the left likes to hear. To some degree, I think that's well earned, but he often then just comes right out of right field, boom, with a word like despicable, or when he talks about abortion as being hiring a hitman to kill your child. I mean, I would never speak like that. I wouldn't even call surrogate motherhood despicable. It probably is, but the point is that I would be a little more guarded. So he has this tendency to sometimes go wham, and you kind of got that here. He would say that, but he does show some sympathy. Look, as I said on the show the other day, look, I don't think a lot of people have thought through IVF or even surrogacy well enough. They should think about some of the implications. What are we saying about marriage? What are we saying about the sacredness of human life? What are we saying about those things, you see? Well, we'll do more of that on the other side of the break, but I want to talk a little bit more about this, and there's some other really very beefy topics that the Pope handled here in the interview that I think we can continue to further discuss on the other side of the break.
It's to truly save souls. It's to save souls, and we have a lot of different media platforms, whether it's through our TV, radio, music, and it's all promoting this culture that is really here to kill, steal, and destroy souls. And to have that Catholic voice on the air that is proclaiming the good news and able to touch and transform lives, what better thing to support?
The Guadalupe Radio Network, radio for your soul.
Hi, I'm Debbie Georgiani, and I co-host The Spirit World with Adam Bly. This weekend, we will have an exclusive interview. Our guest will be Dr. Mark Miravalli. He is a great expert and teacher on Mary, the Mother of God, and he will join us live to take your questions. We will also talk about the new Vatican norms on apparitions. Listen this Saturday at 10 a.m. Central, right here on the Guadalupe Radio Network.
I'd known about the station for a long time, but I have to confess I never tuned in. Perhaps I was biased. But then that changed, actually. Once I started listening, I kept the dial where it was at. I like Teresa Tomeo and Al Kress, and I just like their personalities. Call to Communion with Dr. Dave Anders and More to Life with the Pop Checks. I really, really love the show. I've learned a lot. But also, I really like that there's prayers interspersed. I get a lot more praying done in the day that I wouldn't otherwise. We want to support the radio station for sure.
The Guadalupe Radio Network, Catholic Radio. Radio for your soul. Welcome back to A Life Lived Joyfully on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Give us a call. The lines are open at 877-757-9424. That's 877-757-9424.
Indeed, it's 877-757-9424. Love to know what you think about it. I think that I'm trying to remain, generally at a 30,000-foot level. I mean, one can quibble about the Pope not using this word or using that word here or there, but I think overall there were some pretty solid answers given that we should take to heart. As you know, even if an answer is difficult, I would like it to be clear and concise, and at times we have not found that lately, but now I think he was pretty darn clear with a couple things he said. Getting back to this question of surrogacy, Nora O'Donnell, of course, there's always this sympathy card they're throwing out. So she says, I know women who are cancer survivors who cannot bear children, and they turn to surrogacy. But this is against church doctrine? And Pope Francis replies, in regard to surrogate motherhood, in the strictest sense of the term, no, it is not authorized. Sometimes surrogacy has become a business, and he says that is very bad, and elsewhere he's called it despicable. And then she says, Nora says, but for some women, it's their only hope. And again, playing the emotion card, and again, emotions, I understand, but that doesn't always mean the answer can be what we want. But anyway, he goes on to say, so for some women, it's their only hope. He says, well, it could be. The other hope is adoption. I would say that in each case, the situation should be carefully and clearly considered, consulting medically and then morally as well. I think there's a general rule in these cases, but you have to go into each case to assess each situation. But as long as, notice that, as long as the moral principle is not skirted. But you were right. I want to tell you, I really like your expression when you told me, in some cases, it's the only chance. It shows that you feel these things very deeply. Thank you. Oh, my, feelings. Nothing more than feelings. Okay, enough of singing from me. But I would say that, look, let's be clear. The Pope doesn't want to just, he's trying to show some sympathy, but at the end of the day, this demand that, well, I had cancer and I can't have a child, therefore I should be able to take my ovum, put it in a petri dish with maybe my own husband's, semen, and then we should put it in a third party, another woman, pay her money, and when the baby's delivered, take the baby and say it's ours. And this goes outside the marriage bond, all these situations. And, maybe sometimes just to accept, God, I don't know why you did that. I kind of wanted to have a child of my own, bear a child in my womb, but it didn't come to be. Well, sometimes we just have to accept that not everyone gets everything they want in life. But we always have to have a solution. Well, sometimes there isn't an answer. Sometimes there isn't a solution. So the Pope suggests adoption, Maybe what God is saying is you're great parents. You'll be great parents. I have some adoptive children I need for you to care for. Huh? Stay open to my will. Huh? Now, of course, we add to this, sometimes it doesn't involve surrogate motherhood. Let's take a woman who, for whatever reason, they're struggling with some type of infertility, the couple is, so they just decide to force the issue. They go down to the local whatever bank and they put the sperm and the ova in the petri dish. Not they, but the so-called, the doctors, whoever, the technicians, and they then put it into the womb of the same mother where it implants. But again, I told you before, usually in those cases, they fertilize a good number of embryos, and then they freeze the ones they don't use, eventually either to be discarded or maybe to be thawed. This is not how you treat human beings, you see. And sometimes God is just saying no. And I think that nobody wants to hear sometimes hard answers, but sometimes the answer just has to be no. This just it turns life into a product. We're playing God, just like we play God when we think, well, I can abort this child, or when we think that, with contraception, in fact, we can just take the Marriage Act and render its life-giving purpose utterly null and void and still call it the Marital Act. And not mutual masturbation or something. So we have to see that we just don't want to play God in these things. Human life is sacred, namely this, that God is its author. And sometimes God is saying no. Sometimes God is saying yes. We have to listen. When God clearly says yes or no, we respond accordingly. Not like, well, this cannot be so. I'm going to force it by using some scientific process. You see, I can't turn the whole show into this, but the Pope is very clear. This is not something that we're free to do. Now, regarding the blessings for same-sex couples, this came up. As you might imagine, it was one of her first questions, not the very first, but she was champing at the bit to bring this one out. And so we see that we have the question she asked about, the same-sex couples. He says here, last year, she gave some background how the Pope had said early in his pontificate regarding homosexual people, who am I to judge? That's not, it's first of all, it's out of context. But secondly, it was an unfortunate turn of a phrase, all right? We're not judging the people and their eternal salvation, but we can and should judge the actions. And the Scripture describes these things as not permitted, as sinful. But anyway, she gives that background. And then she says, sort of expecting to hear great, she's trying to reach out to him. So therefore, you decided last year to allow Catholic priests to bless same-sex couples. That's a big change. Why? All right. Now, by the way, her misunderstanding of that whole thing is understandable. And we've had discussions about that here. We're talking out of both sides of our mouths, a lot of double talk around that. But nevertheless, the Pope does answer rather clearly. He says, again, her question is, she says, you allowed Catholic priests to bless same-sex couples. That's a big change. He says, no. What I allowed was not to bless the union. That cannot be done because it is not the sacrament. I cannot. I cannot allow that, you see. The Lord made it that way. But to bless each person, yes. The blessings are for everyone. For everyone. To bless a homosexual type union, however, goes against the given right, against the law of the church. Right doesn't, R-I-T-E, right, okay? Goes against the given right, against church, the law of the church. But to bless each person, well, why not? The blessings are for everyone. Some people were scandalized by this, but why? Everyone, he says. Now, again, as I said to you, her misunderstanding of this is understandable because it even in the document it says it's the blessing of couples. But then you say, well, when we say blessing of couples, we don't mean blessing of couples. Well, then why are we saying blessing of couples? It comes back to language again, doesn't it? Big bugaboo. We use these things called words, and words mean things. It's like saying, bless my bicycle. No, I can't do that, but I can bless each wheel. Well, it's just silly, and we have, so if we're saying we're blessing a couple, we're blessing what that couple is doing. However, if we just say, well, I'll give you a blessing or you a blessing, well, that is a different matter, but that isn't really, the Vatican was sort of talking out of both sides of its mouth. Now, come on, that's just the honest answer here. They wanted to have it both ways, and you just can't. You can't call it the blessing of couples and then say, well, we're not talking about blessing couples. You just can't do that. And yet that's exactly what the document does. So why are people upset? Why are people, well, I'll tell you why, because precision's important at times, But anyway, but let's go back to what the Pope does, and he does well here. He says, no. I did not allow them to bless the union. That cannot be done, he says, because it is not the sacrament. Very clear. So I cannot, in other words, he means by that, I cannot, give approval for these blessings. And then he goes on to say, the Lord made it this way. All right. Very important. You see, we don't just make up sacraments. Well, we want to change this. Or, Oreo cookies and milk are better for children's mass than bread and wine. Or beer and pretzels for the men's retreat instead of, bread and wine for the Eucharist. No, we can't toy with things like that, right? So the Lord gives us sacraments. He makes the sacraments a certain way. So again, he goes on to say, to bless a homosexual type union goes against the given R-I-T-E, the given right. It goes against the law of the church. And not just, I would say, I would just add, not just the law of the church, but natural law. And again, the very clear teaching of Christ. So again, but we can go on, he says, and bless each person. Well, that's always been true. You didn't need a document to say that. Somebody comes up to me and says, Father, could you give me a blessing? I'm getting ready to go on a trip or something. Sure. I don't say, well, no, tell me about your sexual life, or tell me about your finances. Are you being just to your employees? I don't make an inquiry. Somebody says, could you give me a quick blessing? Sure, here. That's done all the time. Well, and again, we talked about this in different shows, and I'm not the only one who's talked about it. But nevertheless, while Miss O'Donnell can be excused for thinking that instructions on how to bless, quote, couples of the same sex were about how to bless couples of the same sex. Pope Francis says, no, this is an incorrect interpretation, and he's very insistent that it is. So again, let's just take this as once again there's if you want to call that there's a very important thing that he's insisting that I am making this distinction, even if you don't think I am, right? And maybe that's the best way to interpret it. Another interesting thing that came up, I thought he was very even-handed when it came to a very, very divisive thing, especially in this country, regarding Israel and Gaza. And I thought the Pope handled it pretty well. It handled it pretty well. And namely, so here's her question. She says, what's happening, namely in Israel and Gaza, has caused so much division, so much pain around the world. I don't know if you've seen it in the United States. There's big protests on college campuses and growing anti-Semitism. So what would you say about how to change that? Here's how the Pope answers. There's a second part to his answer, too. All ideology is bad. Well, and anti-Semitism as an ideology is bad. Any anti is always bad. He's okay, all right. I don't know if every anti is bad, but I get what he's saying. It's an expression. You can criticize one government or another. The government of Israel, the Palestinian government, you can criticize those all you want, but not anti-people, neither anti-Palestinian nor anti-Semitic, namely anti-Jewish, And so she says, I know that you called for peace. You called for a ceasefire. But can you help negotiate peace? And he basically, I think, is being realistic and saying, well, I can certainly pray. But again, he goes on like that. But again, I think he's very correct in saying, it's one thing to distinguish the actions of a government of Israel, the government, the Hamas, the government of the Palestinians. But at the end of the day, not every Palestinian agrees with Hamas, and not every Jewish person agrees with what's going on in Gaza right now. And why don't we still seek to love one another instead of just blame each other for the actions of certain governments? I think that's a good approach. See you on the other side of the break.
Hey, Donnie, what are the two most important things we receive at Mass?
The Christmas scripture.
That's right. All right, one more. Who loves you the most?
Jesus.
That's right.
Mary.
That's right. They love us too. If you don't educate your children in the faith, who will? Educate yourself and your family by listening daily to the Guadalupe Radio Network, and make sure to get the GRN app by logging online to grnonline.com.
Hi, this is Trent Horn from Catholic Answers. Has anyone ever told you that they believe abortion is wrong, except in the case of rape? It's easy for pro-lifers to come off as uncaring towards women when they talk about this issue, especially if they only say rape accounts for 1% of abortions. That's true, but more should be said. Strongly affirm that rape is an awful crime, and that women are victimized when others don't take this crime seriously. Some countries execute rape victims in honor killings, which is barbaric. In our country, we don't execute rapists, much less rape victims, and yet we execute the child who was conceived in rape, the other innocent party. Shouldn't we oppose acts of violence against rape victims and the children conceived through rape? This has been Trent Horn with a Catholic Answers Pro-Life Minute. For my free pro-life booklet that will make you better at defending human life, visit whyweareprolife.com.
I don't know why I turned on my radio, because I've kept my radio off for years. And once I turned it on, I was absolutely hooked. I love the shows with the Catholic apologist. I love the shows with the sort of day-to-day psychologist, Greg and Lisa Popchak. I love hearing not just of other people's problems who call in, but I love getting the Catholic take on how to deal with day-to-day reality.
The Guadalupe Radio Network, radio for your soul. Welcome back to A Life Lived Joyfully on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Give us a call. The lines are open at 877-757-9424. That's 877-757-9424.
Yeah, just give it to you one more time, which is 877-757-9424. So I don't know, what do you think? Am I being too easy on the Pope here? Am I being too hard? You tell me. Give me a call. Let me know. I know that some people, there's a danger. I've been a critic of our Holy Father's, some of his words or policies. He is, nevertheless, just as I was when my earthly father was alive. I might have some differences, but I always had great respect and reverence for my father, and I think the same thing, as I hope, for the Holy Father. And I try not to just immediately rush to criticize. What's the first thing I can find to criticize? I do have some critiques I want to go to here in a few moments, but I got a couple more things that I think he handles generally quite well, at least if you look at some of the background text. But I'd like to know, what do you think? Am I missing some things that maybe either bothered you? I'm going to cover a couple of things that bothered me, but I'm choosing to leave them toward the end. Now, going to the question of immigration, there's a question here that the Pope deals with immigration. So Nora O'Donnell asks, she says, your first trip as Pope was you made. I was struck what you talked about, the globalization of indifference. What's happening? And she was speaking about, he went to Lampedusa, where he talked about suffering of migrants and immigrants and so on. So he says, you talked about the globalization of indifference. So he says, so the Pope says, do you want me to state it plainly? He says, people wash their hands. There are so many Pontius Pilates on the loose out there who see what is happening, like the wars, the injustice, the crime, and they say, that's okay, and they wash their hands. It's indifference. That is what happens when the heart hardens and becomes indifferent. Please, we have to get our hearts to feel again. We cannot remain indifferent in the face of such human dramas. The globalization of indifference is a very ugly disease, very ugly, he says. But he also goes on here and talks about migrants with her. And he says here, migrants suffer a lot. They suffer a lot. He said in response to the question about the Texas border. There was you might recall, they were trying to shut down a Catholic service agency that was helping migrants who, they weren't inquiring into all their immigrant status and legalities and things. They were just there whenever they encountered a group of migrants that came in their general vicinity. They would just help them. And so there were people who were calling on them to be shut down by the federal government. And the Pope simply says, that's madness, sheer madness, to close the border and then leave them there. That is madness. The migrant has to be received, he says. Thereafter, you're going to have to deal with him. Maybe you have to send him back. I don't know, but each case ought to be considered humanely. Now, the idea here is he's saying basically what the Catechism says, that especially affluent countries, and we are certainly that, should be generous in receiving migrants who come to them, especially as a result of social injustices or war, or sometimes complete economic loss. I mean, so many of these countries are so poorly run to the south of us. Some of them are communist or socialist. Some of them are just beset with violence and crime and drug problems, and they coming here looking for opportunity. They're in economic disasters they're leaving. So again, for all these reasons, I think that the Church has been always teaching that prosperous countries should be generous in receiving these folks. But notice again, the Pope does give a caveat, even here in his address to Nora O'Donnell. Maybe you have to send him back. Now, Father Raymond de Sousa came up with a very a good insight into what he means by this. He's quoting the Pope from 2016 when he was returning from Sweden. And he spoke a little bit more in depth about this idea of how we have to qualify. That the Pope is not simply an advocate for unlimited immigration, open borders for migrants with absolutely no limits. He comes across that way, and most people think of him that way, but that he does actually have some caveats that he introduces. So, for example, this is a quote from 2016. In theory, the Pope said, hearts must not be closed to refugees. But those who govern need prudence. They have to be very open to receiving refugees, but they also have to calculate how best to settle them. Because refugees must not only be accepted, but integrated. Very important word. Consequently, if a country has, say, the ability to integrate just 20 persons, they should do this. If another country has a greater capacity, they should do more, but always with an open heart. He goes on to say, though a political price can be paid for imprudent judgments, for accepting more than can be integrated. What is the danger when refugees or migrants, and this applies to everybody, are not integrated? They become like a ghetto, a culture that does not develop in a relationship with the other culture they've entered. This is dangerous. Pretty good stuff, because the second half of the Catechism on this topic of migration says that not only should countries that are prosperous be generous, however, those who enter those countries should follow just laws, including immigration laws, should follow just laws and then seek to integrate themselves into the culture that receives them, not by losing all of their, it's not a question of, he stopped speaking that language or stop eating that kind of food, but generally speaking, they're going to want to also love and respect the people they join and not just say, we're living apart here and we're not going to have anything to do with the culture, we're just coming here for your money. Well, that's not appropriate either. So again, both on the side of immigrants and the side of the receiving country, there should be a spirit of generosity, seeking to live in communion and unity, respecting laws and traditions and customs of the country where they go, and so on. That, my friends, is the fuller story of immigration. We only usually get in the media, and frankly, some of our clergy only quote the first part. We're supposed to let them all in. Well, that's not what the Catechism says, and that's not what the Pope, well, at least in general, has said in the past, that there can and there need to be prudential limits, and that's just simply going to be the way it is. We just can't do everything for everybody all the time, all right? And again, therefore, there have to be some prudential matters that are involved, and I think that's well said. Now, we also then want to start turning our attention. There's something implied, and this is, again, I'm following from Father Raymond de Souza's article in the National Catholic Register. It's linked here at our show, at the show notes. I want to read you what he says, because I think he's exactly right about this too, and I sort of hinted at it earlier. So Raymond de Souza writes, though synodality was not discussed in the interview, what secular reporter would use a word like synodality? It's crazy. It's a crazy in-house, churchy word. Okay, but though synodality was not discussed in the interview, the Holy Father's response on women deacons implied a certain no to the synodal process. The October Assembly had voted in favor of further discussion of the question, and a few months ago, Pope Francis himself even set up a group to study the question. Again. But the synodal consultation will now will not matter. They're not going to take no for an answer. But I disagree with Father de Souza a little there. However, Phyllis Zagano, a longtime advocate of the female diaconate and a member of the First Vatican Study Commission on the topic under Francis, told America magazine, but surely Pope Francis did not intend to shut down several decades of study and ignore the import of spirit-led discernment, which he has been so keen to emphasize as the modus operandi of the Catholic Church. Surely he didn't. Well, I'm afraid in a way he did. Whether he meant to or not, he said a very definitive no. If by women deacons we mean who have holy orders, no. I think it was pretty definitive. But again, should a pope be addressing this issue definitively in an interview with Nora O'Donnell is a legitimate question. I don't know that popes should be giving all these kinds of interviews. That's a whole different matter I mentioned earlier. But anyway, so Raymond de Souza, says that, well, surely he did mean to shut down the in quotes, spirit-led discernment. In the same way that he surely ignored the synodal process when he authorized what everybody thought were blessings for same-sex couples. Synodality begins and ends exactly where the Holy Father says, which is something of a no to visions of the synodal process, which imagine a more synodal synodality. That's all going to come down to just a democratic process and voting and lay people interacting with clergy and kind of stuff like that. And of course, there's a lot of people, even on the left, who have concerns that that's just not the structure of the church. That's just not how we run. It is something that the clergy do have a significant role in terms of crafting understanding doctrine and crafting important teachings related to doctrine. And yeah. But it's sort of a hidden answer that synodality can only go so far. You can imagine anything you want, I guess, in the synodal process. We want dancing girls and men who walk on their hands to be part of the liturgy. You can imagine these things all you want, but the question is ultimately somebody has to say yes or no, and that's going to be the Pope and the bishops in union with him, and that's where real doctrine comes from. All right, and or shall we say, it's discovered. So that's, I think, an important thing. Now, a couple of other things. We got 2 minutes before our next break, but I want to introduce a couple of topics that I found. I have to say that I'm a bit critical of. One is his characterization of more conservative bishops, and also then the question of how the question of the sex abuse scandal was handled, both by the interviewer and mostly by her more than the Pope. But I think the questions that she didn't ask are significant when it comes to that. So let's begin by turning our attention to maybe that particular topic, the zero tolerance. There's a sort of background here that question she asked, and I think it's sort of a flattering question. It's not necessarily entirely true. She says, "You have done more than anyone else to try and reform the Catholic Church and repent for years of unspeakable sexual abuse against children by members of the clergy. But has the Church done enough?" Well, I think, first of all, they denigrate his predecessor, Benedict, who worked very, very hard in a way that it was often hidden. And I don't think Pope Francis has done more than anyone else. I think there's some real criticisms, and we'll talk about that on the other side of the break, and I'll spell that out, but I think some of you know what I'm talking about. There's some people he seems to be protecting that deserves a question and an answer. We'll talk then on the other side of the break.
I might have gone to church, at Christmas time, gradually quit going. It's not as scary as I thought it was. It's a much more warm and open place, and God really is about love. It's not about the rules and the things that I remember as a young child. It really is about the love that God has for each one of us that's so deep and wonderful.
If you've been away from the Catholic Church for any reason, visit CatholicsComeHome.org.
Thank you for listening to the Guadalupe Radio Network and being part of the family. Families pray for each other. We would be honored if you would let us pray with you and for you. You don't even have to tell us your name. Just go to our website, grnonline.com, or call our prayer request line and leave us a message at 800-395-4008. That's 800-395-4008. We will be praying for you every day.
So the neighbor who we've spoken to, just in greeting, but who I don't believe has ever spoken back to us, out of the blue, surprised us. One day we were getting the kids in the car for Mass and asked us if we were going to Mass. I was dumbstruck for about probably 10 seconds. It was great that we had an opportunity to share about our parish and that we were Catholic. Turned out she was Catholic too, and she assumed we were because of the bumper sticker on our car.
The Guadalupe Radio Network. Radio for your soul.
Welcome back to A Life Lived Joyfully on the Guadalupe Radio Network. Give us a call. The lines are open at 877-757-9424. That's 877-757-9424.
And we are back. And I'm going to start calling some of you. If you don't call me, I'm going to pick up the phone and call some of y'all and do some random dialing. You're supposed to. You give me a call, all right? We're getting late in the show now, though, but as I say, I do want to hear from you all. I get bored listening just to myself, all right? Now, look, I want to say that the question that Nora O'Donnell is pure flattery. No one has done any more than you have to try to reform the Catholic Church and clean up the unspeakable sexual abuse. So again, we have the that's just flattery. Pope Benedict worked very hard, first of all, and arguably, I think there were over 3,000 clerics he had dismissed for this crime. I want to say, when Nora O'Donnell says zero tolerance, I think that he said, you have said zero tolerance. He says, yes, it cannot be tolerated. When there is a case of a religious man or a woman who abuses, the full force of the law should fall upon them. In this, there has been a great deal of progress. Well, I have to say, and she had to have done some of her homework. There are very serious people that the Pope has protected and is now protecting. And I can only say that I think of Cardinal Godfrey de Niels, I think of Conrad or Murphy Rodriguez, Maradiaga. I mean, they're just the list goes on. Cardinal McCarrick, but I think the most important or significant one that's ongoing right now, and it's just a terrible glare and a real bug in the ointment, which is this guy Father Rupnik, and he's been accused by just dozens of women of terrible sexual abuse, and he's being, I would argue, protected by the Pope. He should not be in active ministry, certainly not in the Vatican right now where he is. And I can't go on. I mean, I don't know every detail, but I know that even the Pope's fiercest, his greatest supporters are very troubled by this. It's just glaring and puzzling. So she didn't ask that. She should have. She should have done her homework. I think she did. She just chose not to ask it. Now, look, we have a call. Joe from South Texas, and you have a question about immigration. So I'll bet you do in South Texas.
Hi, thank you for letting me on today. Yeah, I just heard you discussing that particular. It's been bothering me for some time, and me being of Mexican American descent, I guess it could be a little controversial. But my question in particular is, considering that I'm in a devout Christian and going to church more and more every day and every week. How do we deal with the fact that our archetypes, heaven, Eden, Israel, even Old Testament, New Testament, and even till today, there are strict immigration policies, to put it lightly. How do we deal with that in our present day situation, considering that we do have legal entry, asylum seeking policies, and so forth? When does too much become too much, and who will be the one in the Christian community to put their foot down and start saying that what we should do and shouldn't do? Thank you for your time.
Yeah, sure. I have to say that if you look at the scriptures, there are very strong admonitions against any interaction with other cultures, any intermarriage. All that is primarily the Old Testament. Paul talks about avoiding bad company, but it has nothing to do with racial things. It's just about people who behave badly. But generally, in the New Testament, the Lord said, "Go therefore unto all the nations." So he took that. You see, I think there was an Old Testament context. God wanted to have Israel formed, kind of like a seed bed or a place where just to grow the law and grow up a people from which he would send his son to be Messiah. So again, the vision here is that that did change in biblical times. There are very clear warnings in the Old Testament, which were, by the way, often repeatedly broken, and sometimes God even punished them for it. On the other hand, you have in the New Testament a call to go into all the nations. And one of the earliest struggles in the early church was how to deal with very different experiences between Jews and Gentiles. So I hope I'm not misinterpreting your question, but Joe, do you want to make sure that am I clarifying? You want to clarify it for me?
Yes, and you are going there, and my main point being is that there seems to be some sort of malicious intent behind all this immigration, it being a cultural genocide. And what I refer to that, strongly speaking, is Bella Dodd's testimony in the House of Un-American Activities in the 50s, and her referencing the homosexual and communist invasion, infiltration into the American government and the Vatican Church. So that being a strong kernel of truth, it's pointing to the fact that our government is not exactly to our favor, at least within certain facets of the government. So us being Christians, me dealing with that fact, I don't know how to proceed further other than, just delving stricter into the word and bringing up discussions like this on radio talk shows.
Yeah. Well, by the way, I think it's right for us to have a patriotism that loves our culture and loves our country as it is. On the other hand, we are a nation of immigrants, and I think we have to learn to balance this. Is that part of what makes us who we are is the amazing diversity. However, diversity can be a real problem if there isn't a core of unity. It's like having a wagon wheel with all the spokes but no hub to connect to. They're all flying around and hitting everybody. So the point is that we need that central core, the Judeo-Christian worldview, our Constitution at the governmental level, all these things that should be insisted upon. And I think you're right. There are times where there are some people who are trying to just undermine all that and just flood the system with chaos and disunity so that they can kind of come in with their own, kind of worldview and so on. I think that's about the best I can do, Joe, right now. I think we have to find the balance, be generous, but also insist on integration as a goal for every immigrant who comes to the beautiful American genius that we have in this country. All right? So, now, just one final thought about the Pope's remarks. He did make a remark about conservative bishops, and he says, how do you address their criticisms of you? And Pope Francis says, you use the adjective conservative. That is one who clings to something and does not want to see beyond that. Well, okay. He said this is suicidal because it is one thing to take tradition into account, to consider situations from the past, but it's quite another to be closed up inside of a dogmatic box. Okay. I would like to see that nuanced by him. I think sometimes he illustrates the very thing he's condemning. Santo Padre. I love the world that I live in, but I love the tradition, and I want to bring them together. I don't feel like I'm in a box. Of course, I'm not a bishop, but I identify with what called conservatives in the church, and I don't like to be called either suicidal or caught up in boxes. Maybe we could have more of a discussion that was less ad hominem in the attacks. I mean, I've been a critic of the Pope on this in the past, and I'll leave it at that. But overall, I thought it was a good interview. I think the Holy Father did do important work in holding the line, and I think that's part of the job of the Pope. And may he be blessed. May Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Transmitting the treasures of our Catholic faith to your radio every day. This is the Guadalupe Radio Network. Radio for your soul.